Warning! This review will contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen the episode by now, I advise you do so before watching this video. If you decide against this advice, however, you waive the right to inquire about legal recourse in regards to your hurt feelings, because it's all your fault. Also, if you spoil future episodes in the comment section, a fate worse than death will be coming your way. Rainbow Dash and Applejack are a, competitive pairing. So knowing their past records, will this episode prove dynamic and exciting, or against all odds, underwhelm? I mean, it has to be good, right? We'll find out in due time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pones N Stuff. You'll be very surprised to know how long it's been since we had Rainbow Dash and Applejack at the centre of an episode's plot together. Outside of the supporting roles in Buttball season and Rainbow Dash's main and Applejack's supporting roles in 28 Pranks Later, you have to go back to Season 1's Fall Weather Friends to have these two leading one forward right from the get-go. That's 7 long years. So do they have a way to build on what that episode gave to us? The answer, to be frank, is no. This Season 8 episode did something that I cannot quite believe it actually persevered with. Forgetting the moral that the episode 7 years prior in Season 1 set up for itself. You know, the moral about how competitiveness is not worth it if it damages your friendships and causes problems with your reputation. I'm sorry, how can they forget such an important lesson for these two characters in one of the few episodes they actually had together? It doesn't make any sense, and it made everything that Applejack and Rainbow Dash did in this 22-minute episode unbearable because it lost all structural footing it could rest on. Meaning that this episode was already going downhill before it had even started. And you know what? That was only the beginning of its woes. Having the moral of Fall Weather Friends being neglected for the sake of non-compete clause's plot to even have a purpose at all is as maligned a decision as it can be. Shifting the timeline to do the same thing is even worse. How am I supposed to believe it's been 9 months since school days according to Fluttershy's wall of apparent success? Well, if it was established between Season 1's premiere and Season 4's that we had a year go by between the Sunset Festivals, how can 9 months go by between 9 episodes of one season? That doesn't make any sense. A year between Season 4's premiere and Season 8's, now that does make sense given what we know, and I do understand that it hasn't been confirmed what chronological order the episodes make up of a time period, and I will tell you some have tried to figure it out, but it throws a ginormous spanner into proceedings that means I wasn't going to be taking what this episode wanted to do very seriously, because it had the structural rigidity of a termite-infested support bee. Conveniently forgetting a well-established moral to excuse these two characters acting like regressed versions of themselves for the purpose of a stupid conflict took continuity behind the shed and shot it, leaving this episode precariously on a tumultuous journey to try and salvage what it could, which proved problematic when the episode itself continued to not have a leg to stand on. Thematically, it was absent. It had an open-ended conclusion that made the entire sequence of events feel like a waste of time, had action sequences that felt as tired as me after a long sleep, and despite a few sincere laughs, had me wanting to punch the two protagonists turned antagonists for being so tone-deaf and blind to their role as bucking teachers. On top of that, it had a near 3-minute pre-intro, which like many episodes this season distorted the pace and the 3-act structure, leading to a rushed ending, which in its wake left us with a moral that made as much sense as a drunk person telling you their life story, as its execution felt flimsy and contrite, with no air of sympathy for its efforts. The idea of seeing something done wrong to learn how to do it right was learnt, but not conveyed in a way that seemed truthful, as the Student 6 covered for their teachers in a way that insulted my intelligence. none of them, for me, sincerely believed in it, and it made the cumbersome and overbearing process of reaching that point not feel like it was worth it at all, as I struggled to see how this moral could benefit anyone based on what was being witnessed. If the plot revolved around some pony doing something bad enough to be exiled from Ponyville only for them to save someone's life and be welcomed back into the community through friendship, the message would have really stood up on its own 2 feet and be counted. Yet this message of learning and teamwork was so fractured, it didn't benefit us at home or the characters within the story for the most part, leaving me confused and extremely irritated. And to add even more fuel to the fire, having Pinkie Pie foreshadow this episode's plot and character problems wasn't a good idea, because it seemed the writers had realised they'd written this episode into a hole and just had to find as many reasons as possible to try and get it to move. Yet while they struggled in the mud they were creating in this sodden hole that they'd made for themselves, the struggle continued to where it just lost all desire to try anymore. The fact that I just cut off my audio there instead of allowing another angry tangent to run forward should be an indication how annoyed this episode has made me, because from almost every angle there seems to be no praise I can bring forward to make me smile somewhat. And if I do smile, it's one of strained irritation, right? I'm about to bloody explode here. The message fell on its ass. The story just kept burning until it became embers and then ashes. The music was uninspiring and completely bland. The animation, okay, I can praise that somewhat. The Acella's transformations were nice. The camera editing and rendering work of some scenes were nice and fluid, but they were still as uninspiring as you can get in a lot of big scenes and sequences. So I'm still as annoyed as I was when I began. There has to be something I can salvage from this episode, surely, because everything else is going to hell. There's got to be something I can pick from the rubble, dust off, and look at with some positivity. Thankfully, there is one thing: the character writing and voice acting. They can hopefully bring something to the table, even though it seemed, to begin with, that it was going down the same route that all of the friends it had in other categories were. Applejack and Rainbow Dash's brash, obtuse, and petty disregard for order and reason meant that neither of these two could be viewed in a good light. At this point in the show, likability and competitiveness should not be written as a factor for them, and their indecision that came from an attempt to be seen as a cohesive unit failed to help matters, only intensifying them further. They've both achieved most of their goals by this point in the show's run, and they're now teaching the next generation. The fact that they couldn't understand what really mattered in the course of this episode is baffling. And the fact that they weren't able to convey it, it led to an insanely convoluted and frankly ridiculous display that, combined with everything else, just dragged the episode further into the mire. The good news, though, comes from the supporting cast, who did enough to resurrect this category into positive territory. The Student 6 swam through the turgid display of their professor's tedious conflict to give an endearing and grounded display of their naive and wholesomely honest personalities, giving us adorable and comedic moments that made this episode somewhat palatable in small instances, with Acelis and Yona stealing the damn show every single time they spoke or did anything. As for Twilight, at first she looked to have followed her usual story trope of not noticing the errors of her decisions. That's something that has dogged all of her appearances in Season 8 thus far. Thanks to her friends not giving the trust that she'd given to them back, her stern and direct authoritative approach that this revelation had given put her hooves back on solid ground and finally showed through cause and effect that she could hold those who have wronged her to account. Even if she foreshadowed the second half of the episode going much the same way, with consequences she barely even attempted to mask over like her students did, leaving her contribution as mute as it looked from the start, despite a solid showcase of her growth that she should be exhibiting at this point. Pinkie Pie's minimal joking at the beginning gave us some hope, allowing the Student 6 to follow in her footsteps and help things go along, while despite Applejack and Rainbow Dash's failings, I can at least say that Ashley Ball did a fantastic job of conveying their lines with all the power I would expect from her, alongside the rest of the cast. However, However, despite the fact that it allowed a lot of face to be saved when it could have easily been lost, it had a lot of samey delivery, which became quite tired when all is put into consideration. Now, while there are some good points to be found, this episode really doesn't have a lot to help itself with, and it will reflect in the final rating and grade that I will bestow upon it. You know what's crazy? I should know what to say about this episode here and now, because it's as transparent as day and it's as easy to understand based on what I have summarized and highlighted. However, this episode goes one step further and leaves me profoundly speechless that Hasbro could even dare to release an episode as groundless and outstandingly empty as this out onto the airwaves. If this was filler, where no character benefited and it was just there to be somewhat entertaining at some point in the season, I can understand that and be somewhat okay with it, because that would justify why the episode was so bad in the first place. But when you put in characters like the Student 6, who need to be exposed to the audience, who need to have progression and growth highlighted, to have an episode of this quality back that up, means that we've had our time wasted, as it doesn't showcase anything of worth in majorative terms. This episode reminds me of Fluttershy Leans In and Hard to Say Anything last season, which lacked in purpose, ignored continuity, and threw characters under the bus for the sake of a conflict to exist. And the fact this episode has repeated those things is just infuriating. It's befuddling to see happen and makes me feel more annoyed than I need to be. But when I see an episode that can't justify its existence outside of one small, minute reason so bluntly, it means I've wasted my time watching and analysing it. And while there were minimal things to enjoy, like the students, Twilight, some solid voice acting, and some minor camera editing and rendering work, it's all that this episode had to stand on, as everything around it fell apart. If an episode has to dislodge a sense of time and conveniently forget a Season 1 moral and character continuity to come into being, it shows its true colours and becomes one of the worst ever that this show has done. There is no way of getting away from that. But thanks to sheer luck and a bit of kindness on my part for the animation, it avoided joining the cesspool that is the absolute worst by the minutest of margins. But that doesn't stop me from proclaiming loudly and proudly that it got an embarrassing dressing down that it thoroughly deserved. Avoid this episode like the plague, I beg of you. Overall, non-compete clause scored a total of 3 out of 25, which is an E. In closing, this episode amazes me because it should never have performed as badly as this. The sum of its parts had the potential to really become something special, the Student 6 being exposed to new environments that tested their knowledge and relationships and made themselves really grow. You have Applejack and Rainbow Dash, who should be adding action, drama, and comedy, combining it with their relationship, the relationship with the students and the world around them, and you combine that with a moral that on paper would fit into that immensely, creating an escapist, fun, and adventurous episode. I should have been the happiest person in the world. That's what it looked like on paper that I was getting, and I should have been elated. What we got instead was a parody of that. It stripped away all the good points that I've just made and left us with the barest of scraps that when you eat them just taste terrible, reflecting just how poor of a job that this episode puts forward for us. And I'm losing all sense to quantify how bad this episode is. Sure, it's one mark away from where the worst of the worst have been given a place to rest, but I'm better off hitting it over the head with a shovel and burying it alive with them, because it's so close to going in that ridiculously toxic pool that's standing beneath my feet right now. And this is the thing that annoys me even more. There are some people within the community who believe that we should all just sit back and take what we're given, and that we're entitled gits for expecting an episode to be better than what it is. Well, here's the thing. If an episode messes with continuity, timelines, and the morals of past episodes all combined, and then executes it as poorly as this, I have the right to complain, as do many people. We're 8 seasons in. Episodes this bad should not be happening on a somewhat consistent basis. Season 8 has been okay thus far. We've seen some good episodes and a few duds. But not many of the duds have even registered close to this. And that's what worries me, because this episode could be much like last season, the start of the downward spiral into something worse. I don't want that to happen again. I'm trying to remain as positive as possible, because this could just be a blip on the radar, but in all fairness, it might not be. Next week's episode could be bad, and I could be back to square one, repeating the same spiel that I've given today. And I don't want to do that. So I'm left with one statement to make. If next week's episode gets a 10 or above, I will be happy. If not, then you're pretty much going to have to sit through another edition of Pones N Stuff with me ranting. Now, I know some of you enjoy that and find it quite entertaining, but for my sanity, I don't want to have my time watching and analysing these episodes wasted. And the fact that this one just wasted my time without a care in the world should be an indication as to just how sick and tired I am of seeing these kinds of things happen. So next week, I am hoping to see something better. If not, we're going to have some real problems on our hands. And that is not a good thing I can justifiably highlight. I have been Freddie Thomas, you've been people watching, this has been another episode of Pones N Stuff for the CC Network, and I will see you all next time. Hopefully, I will have a smile on my face.